Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. That's a resounding.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good
Good morning.
Good morning.
We can sing it.
Welcome.
Welcome to our master's presentations for this year. We're very excited. We have 5 amazing presentations today from a wide variety of students covering a wide variety of topics. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So our first presenter this morning is Alfred Korankye, right? Did I say that right?
That's right.
Okay, close enough. Alfred was born in, I'm going to butcher all these things, so I'm sorry, Kumasi,
That's right. Yeah, Kumasi.
Ghana.
Yeah.
And has always been passionate about faith, education, and service. Holds a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from Kwame, Nkrumah, University of Science and Technology, and a Bachelor of Arts in Theology with Administration from Christian Service University. Currently, he is in his final year of the Master of Theology program at our beloved Queen's College.
Oh.
He is an ordained minister at House of Faith Ministries, a vibrant charismatic ministry in Ghana. Alfred serves as the national president of the students and associates of the ministry. I did not know that. Wow, that's what
He's impressive.
That's what the official picture is for, right?
By the way, you look much younger in that official picture.
Years ago.
So in that role, he plays a crucial role in mentoring and guiding young leaders. His key research interests include biblical translation and postcolonial studies, and he has already published 2 academic papers with more on the way. Stand back, world. Alfred is happily married to his wife, Frida Nyarko, who is currently in Ghana. He values family as an essential part of his life and continues to balance his academic, ministerial, and personal commitments, and doing a wonderful job. His career aspirations include pastoral ministry, chaplaincy, and further academic research. With a strong foundation in both theology and administration, Alfred is dedicated to making a lasting impact through his faith, scholarship, and leadership. And so the title of Alfred's thesis is God and Human Suffering, a Postcolonial reading of Exodus 2:23-25 and 3:7-10 for the Akan context.
Yeah.
Alfred.
All right. Thank you very much, Reverend Rob. I don't know how I can share my.
Yeah, you should just be able to share.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait a second. Yes, as I was in, I've been introduced. My name is Alfred Korankye, and I want to thank everyone, especially this community, for the love that you have shown. Some of us we felt at home anytime we came around, and it has been a journey I really appreciate because it has really improved me. And I mean, what I'm doing right now. Something I've been struggling to do. Dr. Michelle can attest to this, but I see an improvement in myself, and I hope I do a good delivery here. I'm presenting on the topic God and Human Suffering, a postcolonial reading of Exodus 2:23-25, and chapter 3:7-10 for the context. Okay, so my presentation would cover introduction, research problem. I'll look at research questions, the hypothesis for the research, and the methodology I use arriving at whatever implications I make, the contribution to scholarship to will address that here, and suggestion for further studies before I conclude. by way of overview, human suffering is a universal reality that transcends culture, background, instances, and they mostly appear in diverse forms like oppression, economic hardship, discrimination, other injustice that appear within our community. And these appearances raise deep theological and existential concerns or questions about God's nature and response to suffering. And in theology, these questions are central to discussions on theodicy and divine justice. So because of this, I needed to make inquiry, theological inquiry into the Bible to find out how some of these issues could be addressed. And the numerous texts that I could have visited, I realized that the story of the Israelites in Exodus, particularly that of the Exodus 2:23-25 and 37-10, provides a biblical framework for understanding suffering and divine intervention. These passages describe how the Israelites, after enduring years of forced labor and oppression under Egyptian rule, they cried out to God, and God responded with a promise of deliverance and justice. And this text becomes a model of suffering and resistance and liberation. It has been foundational for many theological traditions, including liberation theology and postcolonial biblical studies. But in my research, I found out that the traditional interpretation of these passages have often been shaped by Eurocentric theological perspectives. And these interpretations fail to consider the specific historical and socio-political realities of postcolonial African societies, like that of the Akan. So, especially, you see how it will be relevant to the Akan people of Ghana, who, despite gaining political independence, continue to experience systemic oppression, socio-economic struggles, and political injustice rooted in colonial legacies. Therefore, I realized that the post-colonial reading of Exodus 2:23-25 and 37-10 is essential to deconstruct the colonial biblical interpretations and interpret the text in a way that is meaningful and liberative for the Akan context. So this study was therefore conducted to bridge this gap by exploring how a post-colonial reading of Exodus can provide new theological insights and empower Akan Christians to engage in faith-based activism against oppression and social injustice. And moving to the research problem. While this passage has often been interpreted as a spiritual story of deliverance, it also has socio-political and liberationist implications, particularly for post-colonial African societies like the Akan. So when I look at the traditional Eurocentric interpretation, I realize that mostly they focused on God's sovereignty, the covenant, salvation history, someone like Gerard von Rath. And these interpretations do not critically engage with how this narrative speaks to contemporary struggles against oppression and injustice in African context. Again, when you look at liberation theologians or someone like Gustavo Gutierrez, he emphasized the Exodus story as a model for social justice. But their interpretation often lack a post-colonial perspective that directly addresses the imperial and colonial legacies embedded in the text. Beyond this, one scholar by the name Federico Alfredo wrote, he did a work on hyphenating Moses and explored post-colonial themes in Exodus. But he did not specifically apply them to Akan suffering and resistance. So I found this as a gap, I saw this as a problem. And moving on to the research problem, therefore, I highlight the gap in scholarship regarding the postcolonial biblical reading of Exodus for the Akan people. The study then seeks to answer the question, how can Exodus 2:23-25 and 3:7-10 be reinterpreted through a postcolonial lens to offer a theological framework for understanding God's response to suffering in the Akan context? Okay. So having established the research problem, the study was guided by 3 key research questions that shaped the analysis and the discussion. These questions allow me to explore the theological, post-colonial, and contextual dimensions of Exodus 2:23-25, 3:7-10, in relation to the suffering of the Akan people. The main research question that came out was, how might a reading of Exodus 2:23-25 and 3:7-10 through a post-colonial theological lens shed light on the historical and ongoing suffering caused by colonialism in the Akan community? I developed 3 sub-questions that guided the research. The first question was, what does an exegetical analysis of Exodus 2:23-25, 3:7-10 reveal about God and human suffering? This question focuses on the theological meaning of the text. It seeks to uncover how these passages describe God's awareness, concern, and response to human suffering and oppression. It also asks whether the divine actions in the text, God seeing, God hearing, God remembering, God knowing the suffering of Israelites, can be applied beyond the biblical context to other oppressed communities. The second question or sub-question in the research area was, what is the post-colonial significance of these passages? I did this to examine how colonialism and imperialism influence biblical interpretations of the text. I used that opportunity to critique traditional interpretation that focus solely on spiritual liberation while neglecting socio-political and social implications for oppressed communities, particularly the Akan. And I also looked at whether the text itself contains colonial undertones or if it can be reclaimed as a decolonial text that resists imperial structures. The third research or sub-research question was, what are the implications of Exodus 2:23-25 and 3:7-10 for the Akan Christian understanding of God and human suffering? This question primarily focused on contextual theology. How can this passage shape Akan Christian perspective on God and suffering? And also, does the Exodus narrative encourage passive endurance of suffering, or does it provide a model for active resistance and social transformation? Or how should Akan churches respond to social injustice based on the theological themes in this passage? So the overview of the research question, to answer this research, by answering this research question, the study seeks to develop a new theological framework that is both biblically grounded and contextually relevant to the struggles of the Akan people. And we move to research hypothesis. Having established the research questions, this study proposes the following hypothesis. By interpreting Exodus 2:23-25 and 3:7-10 through a post-colonial lens in the context of the Akan socio-political struggle, God's response and active involvement in liberating the Israelites provide a critical theological framework through which issues of injustice, oppression, marginalization, and discrimination can be addressed in contemporary Akan society. This hypothesis is based on 3 foundational arguments. The first being the biblical model of God's response to suffering. And that from Exodus chapter 2, 23 to 25 and 10, 3, 7 to 10 describe God's active concern for the suffering of Israelites. The text shows that God hears the cry. He does not ignore the suffering of the oppressed. God remembers his covenant. He remains faithful to his promise of justice and liberation. God takes action. He raises Moses as a man or a human agent to lead the people to freedom. This passage presents a divine pattern of liberation, which is not only spiritual, but also social and political. The study hypothesizes that this same pattern can be applied to the Akan context, where postcolonial suffering persists due to historical oppression and systemic injustice. The second foundation upon which I made this hypothesis was the postcolonial implication of Exodus. I'm sorry, I'm still using this. I'm elaborating on the hypothesis, the post-colonial implications of Exodus. While Exodus is often read as a story of spiritual salvation, this study argues that it is also a post-colonial text that speaks to the experience of people who have suffered under imperial domination, just as the Israelites were oppressed under Pharaoh's rule. Many Akan communities continue to struggle with legacies of colonial rule, including marginalization and economic inequality, political corruption, and governance issues, lingering effect of European imperialism on Akan identity and culture. This hypothesis suggests that decolonizing the interpretation of Exodus, we can see it as a theological resource for addressing modern struggle against oppression in post-colonial societies like Ghana. The third foundation is the role of the church in faith-based activism. If the Exodus story provides a framework for divine intervention in human suffering, then Akan Christianity must also recognize its role in challenging oppression. And this hypothesis, it assumes that the Akan church should not be passive in the face of injustice. Faith must inspire action, just as Moses was called to lead. Christian leaders should also advocate for justice. Theology should be contextualized to address real-life socio-political struggles rather than focusing only on spiritual salvation. This hypothesis will be tested through exegetical analysis, post-colonial critique, and contextual theology to determine whether it holds true in the Akan context. The research methodology, it was a literature-based research, and I did a thematic analysis of existing literature and then the Bible itself. So to test the research hypothesis, this study employed a literature-based approach, and three main methodological frameworks, that's exegetical analysis, post-colonial hermeneutics, and contextual theology, were adopted. These approaches allow for a thorough investigation of Exodus 2:23 and 3:7 to 10 in relation to Akan suffering and post-colonial struggles. Now, looking at exegetical analysis, the first step was to analyze the text, and the text involved what I did here involved a detailed study of the text, historical, literary, and theological context. The approach followed a four-step model: the historical context, literary analysis, theological interpretation, and comparative study. And under the historical, I did that to understand the socio-political environment of Israel's oppression in Egypt. And also with the literary analysis, I examined the structures, the themes, and key Hebrew terms used in the passage. And with the theological interpretation, I explored God's role in suffering and liberation. Comparative study, I identified parallels between Israel oppression and Akan post-colonial struggles. This method helped uncover how the Exodus narrative has been traditionally interpreted and how it could be reread in the context of contemporary African suffering. The second method, which was postcolonial hermeneutics, gave a critical interpretation approach, and it critically examined how colonial history has shaped the interpretation of biblical text. It used postcolonial theory to deconstruct Eurocentric interpretation that have traditionally framed Exodus as a purely spiritual narrative. And it also exposed imperial ideologies embedded in historical readings of the text. Again, it reclaimed Exodus as a liberation text for oppressed groups, including the Akan people. And by applying postcolonial hermeneutics, the study challenges interpretations that have ignored the social, the economic, and political implications of the text and highlights how it speaks to marginalized groups today. The third approach, which was contextual theology, that's the application of the text to the Akan experience, which was the final one, which applies to the biblical and postcolonial finding to the Akan socio-political reality. In this one, it involved studying the Akan socio-political and historical context, and to understand how colonial oppression continued to shape suffering today. Again, it examined Akan Christian beliefs and practices related to suffering, justice, and divine intervention, and proposed a theological framework that empowers Akan Church to address social injustice using biblical principles. And this method ensured that the study is not just theoretical, but also has practical theological implications for Akan Christians today. This methodological approach ensures that the study remains biblically sound, theologically relevant, and socially transformative. Okay, so moving into the exegesis proper, the first step that I did was to conduct exegetical analysis on the text, and it provided the foundation for understanding how God responds to human suffering. This passage marks a turning point in the narrative, shifting the focus from Israel's oppression to God's intervention. Now, I highlighted some themes of colonialism in the Exodus narrative. The text begins with Israel experiencing severe hardship under Pharaoh's rule, and that the first major point I highlighted during the analysis was the Israelites suffering under oppression. And this suffering was not just physical, was forced labor, but also systemic oppression that stripped the Israelites of their dignity and freedom. Again, from this same point, the oppression under Pharaoh mirrors a colonial oppression, making this passage relevant for understanding post-colonial suffering in the Akan context. The second point I highlighted was the cry of the oppressed as an act of resistance. Post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak asked the question, can the subaltern speak? And per my research, I could see that the people cried out, and this suggests that the oppressed can resist oppression through their collective voice. The act of crying out reflects their current struggle against social and economic injustice, where marginalized communities continue to seek justice and recognition. The third point or theme I highlighted during the exegesis was God's response to suffering, which I saw 4 key actions God took that resonate with this research. Number 1, God heard. God listens to the cry of the oppressed, affirming that suffering does not go unnoticed. And at the same God heard, this is significant because Akan communities like the Israelites often feel unheard in socio-political struggles. The second action God took was, Bible said, God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This does not mean he had forgotten, but rather he was now ready to act on his promise. This suggests that God's justice is rooted in his faithfulness to his people and not in arbitrary actions. God saw was the third action God took, and what it means that God actively saw the oppression of the Israelites, indicating divine awareness and empathy. Final point there, God knew. The phrase God knew suggests an intimate experiential knowledge of their suffering. And this foreshadows God's intervention through Moses, emphasizing that divine awareness leads to divine action. Now, the theological implication I glean from this exegesis in threefold. God is deeply involved in human suffering. He does not ignore oppression, but responds actively to the cries of the marginalized. This challenges theological perspective that sees suffering as merely a test of faith without divine intervention. The second theological implication gleaned from the exegesis, God's justice is covenant-based. His response is linked to his covenant, showing that divine justice is part of a larger redemptive plan. The final point under theological implication is God's intervention is a model for resisting oppression. The text suggests that liberation is not only spiritual, but also social and political, a theme that is highly relevant in the Akan postcolonial context. Okay, exegetical analysis of Exodus 3:7 to 10. Building on the previous passage, Exodus 3:7 to 10 shifts from God's awareness of suffering to his direct intervention. And in this verse, God not only acknowledges the oppression of the Israelites, but also declares his intention to act, calling Moses as the leader of their liberation. And under that, I highlighted a number of themes. Number one, God's awareness of suffering. And from the text, Exodus 3:7, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their suffering. This verse echoes the themes from Exodus 2:23, emphasizing that God is not indifferent to oppression. It demonstrates that God is actively engaged in the struggle for justice, an important theological message for the Akan context, when many feel abandoned in their suffering. The second theme highlighted is God's intervention plan. In the text, Exodus 3:8, the Bible says, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This has a postcolonial significance. Just as Israel's sufferings was tied to imperial oppression, the Akan people's struggles today can be traced to colonial structures that continue to marginalize them. The third point I highlighted in the exegesis, Exodus 3, is the commissioning of Moses, and is the climax of the passage in Exodus 3:10, where God calls Moses to act as human agent of deliverance. So now go. That's how the text reads. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And under that, I emphasized on two major points: human agency in divine liberation. God does not act alone. He raises a leader to confront injustice. Moses, an Israelite raised in Pharaoh's palace, represents a hybrid identity. He understands both the oppressor and the oppressed, making him an effective mediator. This mirrors the role of African Christian leaders today, who must navigate colonial legacies and indigenous struggles to advocate for justice. The second point under Moses' commission is confronting imperial power. God's command was radical, is radical. Moses must confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler of his time. This shows that divine justice is not abstract. It requires direct confrontation with oppressive system. This is relevant in the Akan context, where systemic issues such as political corruption, economic inequality, and social injustice require courageous leadership inspired by faith. The theological insight gleaned from this exegesis, I have 3 here. God is not distant from suffering. He sees, he hears, he knows the pain of the oppressed and takes action. The second point, divine liberation is both spiritual and socio-political. God's deliverance is not just about religious salvation, but also freedom from systemic oppression. This challenges the interpretation that focuses on spiritual suffering while ignoring social justice. Third point, human participation is essential to liberation. God calls people like Moses to lead movements for justice, showing that faith must lead to action. For the Akan context, this means that Christian faith should inspire activism against injustice. Postcolonial reading of the text. Having examined the exegetical meaning of Exodus 2:23 and 3:7-10, attention is now shifted to postcolonial reading of the text. This approach helped me to understand how Exodus can speak to the realities of postcolonial suffering and resistance, particularly in the Akan context. Also, it critiqued colonial influences on biblical interpretation and reclaimed the text as a source of empowerment for the oppressed. Some of the themes highlighted in these two texts from a postcolonial perspective are as follows. Number one, empire and systemic oppression. In the Exodus narrative, Egypt represents an imperial system that exploits and dehumanizes the Israelites. The oppression they face is not accidental. It is a deliberate strategy of domination, because there was a forced labor and economic exploitation. As you can see from the text, Pharaoh uses Israelite labor to build his empire, just as colonial rulers exploited African resources for imperial gain. Dehumanization. The Israelites are treated as property rather than people, mirroring how colonial power stripped Africans of agency and identity. Systemic oppression. Pharaoh's policies ensured that oppression is sustained through laws and structures rather than individual acts of cruelty. This resonates with post-colonial Akan struggles, where the economic and political structures established during colonial rule continue to perpetuate inequality and suffering. The second theme highlighted under post-colonial reading of the text was the cry of the oppressed as resistance. Exodus 2:23 described the Israelite suffering in Egypt and their cry for help. In a post-colonial reading, this cry is not merely an expression of despair. It is an act of resistance against imperial oppression. The cry of the Israelites challenges Pharaoh's power. They refuse to be silent in their suffering. In post-colonial Africa, the oppressed have continued to resist colonial legacy, whether through political movement, cultural revival, or theological decolonization. Akan resistance movement, including anti-colonial struggles, reflect the same spirit of protest seen in Exodus. The third theme highlighted in post-colonial reading of the text, God's remembrance as identity reclamation. Exodus 2:24 states that God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this highlights a major post-colonial theme. Colonialism disrupted African identity, replacing indigenous cultures with European ideologies. God's remembrance in Exodus signifies a restoration of identity. Israel is not just a group of slaves, they are a covenant people. In post-colonial theology, reclaiming cultural and spiritual identity is an act of liberation. For the Akan, this means that post-colonial theology must affirm Akan cultural heritage rather than allowing Christianity to be used as a tool for further colonization. The fourth point highlighted from a postcolonial perspective, God's intervention as an act of justice against imperial rule. God declares in Exodus 3:8, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of Egyptians. This is not passive acknowledgement of suffering. It is an act of revolutionary justice. God's intervention directly opposes Pharaoh's oppressive rule. In post-colonial struggle, resistance against unjust system is a theological imperative. For the Akan context, this means that faith must not only comfort the suffering, but also challenge and confront the structures that cause suffering. This challenges interpretation that focus on holy spiritual salvation while ignoring economic and political liberation. The last theme highlighted from a post-colonial perspective is human agency. I think I didn't show that one here. Human agency in liberation. That is Moses acting as a mediator of justice. God's call to Moses in Exodus 3 suggests that divine justice is not carried out in isolation. It requires human participation. God calls Moses to confront Pharaoh, showing that liberation requires bold leadership. In post-colonial Africa, this means that church leaders, theologians, and activists must take up the mantle of justice. Akan Christian leaders have a responsibility to challenge political corruption, social inequality, and the ongoing effect of colonialism. This reading of Exodus challenges passive Christianity that accepts suffering as faith, affirms that faith should lead to action and transformation. In the next, this reading challenges us to ask an important question. How can Akan Christian use Exodus as a theological foundation for justice today? In the next session, I explored how these insights can be applied to the Akan Christian experience, shaping a theology of resistance and liberation. That's contextualizing the text for the Akan. Now that we have examined the post-colonial themes in Exodus 2:23 and 3:7-10, this step is to apply this insight into the Akan socio-political and theological context. And it explored how the themes of suffering, resistance, and divine justice in Exodus relate to the Akan experience, offering a framework for a contextual theology. Historical, the first part of this section of my research, I did a historical and socio-political struggles of the Akan. The Akan people, like the Israelites, have endured historical oppression and systemic injustice, first under colonial rule and later through post-colonial governance challenges. Colonial legacies continue to shape economic inequality, political corruption, and social injustice. Despite Ghana's independence, Akan communities still face issues like land dispossession, economic hardship, and marginalization. The exploitation of natural resources such as gold, cocoa, reflects the colonial pattern of economic control, where wealth is extracted but does not benefit local communities. This is similar to Israel's forced labor under Pharaoh, where work enriched the empire while they remained impoverished. In both cases, there is a need for a theology that addresses systemic oppression. The second part of this section of my research, I did a theological implication for Akan Christians, getting closer to the end of my presentation, actually.
Yeah, you 5 minutes.
All right. Okay, theological, sorry about it. Theological.
We should have numbers here, we could just hold up.
The theological implication for the Akan context, God is actively concerned with Akan suffering, the church's role in social justice, a shift from passive endurance to active resistance. These are the theological implications I would have explained, but I have to give the main point. Okay, and before contribution to scholarship, reinterpreting Exodus as a liberation text for the Akan. Akan Christianity has historically been influenced by missionary teachings, which often emphasize obedience and endurance rather than resistance. This study suggests that the Exodus story should be reclaimed as a liberation text. Akan theology should be emphasized, should emphasize God's justice, not just endurance or suffering. Faith must lead to action like Moses. The church must challenge on structures. Now, contribution to scholarship. The study makes significant contribution to 3 key areas. That's biblical theological scholarship. That's number 1, expanding postcolonial biblical interpretation to enhancing African theological discourse on suffering. And the third one, providing a framework for liberation theology in Akan Christianity. I would have explained, but the suggestion for further studies, since the work is not exhaustive, definitely there will be loopholes, and it will give or be a platform for others to make further research. And I have 4 of them: a comparative study, one we can further in future study around comparative study of Exodus and other biblical liberation narratives, since I restricted myself to a specific text. And again, expanding postcolonial biblical interpretation to other Akan contexts, Old Testament, New Testament, and all of them. We can look at that. The role of the Akan church in faith-based activism. Yes, the Akan church has a role to play in so many ways. Someone can look at that from a different perspective. And also the final point, decolonizing theological education in Africa. Some institutions must know how to contextualize theology and the development of an African-centered biblical community that fully integrates indigenous worldview in biblical faith. Conclusion. In conclusion, this study has examined the text through a postcolonial theological lens, demonstrating how these passages provide a framework for understanding God's response to suffering and oppression in the African context. It has addressed 3 key areas. Okay, they are not in here. Let me mention the biblical exegesis, postcolonial interpretation, and contextual application. Key theological implications, let me mention them, then I'll end it. God's justice is both spiritual and social. Faith must inspire resistance against oppression. The Akan church's responsibility in social justice. And my closing remark, I would want to thank my supervisor, Dr. Trevor, and the faculty members as well, Dr. Kwame, Dr. Michelle, everyone here. I appreciate your support and love. You have brought me this far. God bless you. Thank you.
We had a whole minute to spare. So again, thank you all for that. Wonderful. We'll take a few minutes now for some questions. If you're online, I would ask if you put up your hand. If you don't know how to use the hand raising function on Zoom, turn on your camera and wave at us until someone gets you. So in the room, you can just raise your hand. And Michelle, and then John.
I asked you this question during the thesis writing course, I remember, and you didn't address it here, and I'm just wondering again. So you talk about how liberation is both spiritual and socio-political, but you don't mention the geopolitical factor. Because the main difference between the Exodus narrative and the Akan narrative, and for that matter, the Indigenous narrative in Canada too, is that in the Exodus narrative, the Israelites are not in their homeland, and their liberation, they're oppressed in somebody else's homeland. And their liberation consists of God getting them out of that and bringing them back to their homeland. Whereas in the Akan context, or in the Indigenous context, somebody comes into their homeland and oppresses them. So the liberation is going to look slightly different. So what's the Because it's almost like, I mean, the whole social political structure of oppression can definitely be applied across those different examples. But what about the geopolitical? And I'm not suggesting that the Egyptians were right to oppress the Israelites in their own homeland. But how do you address that difference?
Okay. I remember you asked the question. Just as I said, when it comes to post-colonial studies, normally it doesn't matter where the oppression is. You can't justify it because probably it's outside the person's comfort zone or outside a specific area. Even if, for instance, myself, I'm in a foreign land, if I'm treated in a certain way, post-colonial studies has a way of highlighting some of these oppressive systems that is being meted out to some of us. And if I'm in my own homeland too, just like the Akan people, the leaders, the government and all of that, they are doing the same thing to their own people. So it does not justify the action, no matter where the person who is suffering the issue is based. So it can be in his own homeland, just like my people Akan. It can be Israelite in a foreign land like myself being here, but I'm still being oppressed. So when it comes to post-colonial studies, it doesn't matter the location. As long as you are not treating the person well, I think it's a way to there's a way to address it for everyone's, because we all want to enjoy equal rights.
It might be interesting if you took the approach of comparing not the Israelites with your context, but with the Canaanites and your context. That might be.
That would be his further study that.
Yeah.
That's your PhD.
There's some work being done amongst North American indigenous peoples to say we can't relate to the liberation story because in that story we're the Canaanites.
Okay.
Right, so they approach it from a different. So it might be interesting to take that tack. Before we go to John, do you mind to stop sharing your screen so we can see? While you're doing that, John can start talking. Go ahead.
My question is sort of been answered, but you'll talk about the liberation within the Akan people. But have you suggested anywhere that this could be used more broadly with our Indian, our Native Americans, or the African Americans, or those who are oppressed because of sexuality, language, all over the world? Because they each were oppressed. The situation might be different in the way they were oppressed, but with our Aboriginal folks, it was very much the same way. But in other ways, it might not be but I'm sure your paper could be used in many contexts.
Yes,
or even poor and rich people.
during in the section of suggested area and then the contribution as well. If I had explained, I had some of these issues addressed that.
Okay.
Some, I mean, it can be applied in some context. Even it has become a platform for some of these other countries, other people that have been oppressed to leverage on the ideologies and the approach that has been suggested to resolve their issues as well.
Okay, I have not had the pleasure of teaching you, Alfred. I've heard how brilliant you are, now I know. One of the things I found interesting, it's not in my mind, and I know this is just a brief overview of your research, but as you were talking about, I wonder, did you, in your exegetical analysis, historical analysis, did you look at how the Exodus story became central to the Israelite identity while they were in exile?
Yeah,
like so because it becomes a part of the canon while they are experiencing oppression by someone else, right?
Yeah, when they were in Babylon, I mentioned something like that. The story took shape during that time. So
Yeah.
I mentioned that in the
Yeah, and I really like.
And
the-
they did not think about it when they were oppressing the people of the lands they took over.
It's funny how that works, but but I also think it's really interesting, and I like what you did, that it's that the theology has to be not just about what God intends, but how we respond. So we don't enact what God intends, we be continually to be oppressed. We don't believe God intends to set us free, then we are oppressed. Like, we have to believe that and act out of it. And I like that you emphasize that. And I think that that's making that switch, or consciousness rising, we said in the other class we were in, like that's the hardest part, and it's the hardest part Moses had to deal with too.
Anybody online have a question for Alfred? Go ahead, Karen.
I not so much a question as a comment. I found very interesting that you talked about Moses as being sort of the hybrid, the one who was both part of the people and also part of the system that did the oppression, so that you had in the one person you had those two identities. And I think there's something about that I'd like to see some more work done around. It's just the notion that as long as you're polarized in one part or another, it's very, very difficult to see a way of moving forward that is able to both use the system and resist the system at the same time. And at the beginning of the readings, well, Moses tries to use the system, and then when all else fails, he doesn't. But I think there's something really significant about that might be another point for some further scholarship and discussion. Thank you. And I really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you. Wonderful work, Alfred, but I'm not the least bit surprised.
Final comments?
No, I can just say that I know with what things like for me in particular is that whole question has been hanging over the formation course we've been doing. What's next in terms of the Indigenous situation in Canada? And even though we start to identify with their experience and hear it, you know, what steps do we take? And do we passively wait for God to intervene somehow, or does he work through us? Because some of the readings we've been doing for Michelle's course looks at that connection between change and the social justice that has accompanied any change to in the Indigenous Christian worldview, which is not just passively observing, it is taking steps to change the environment in the world we live in. And that really highlighted that for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
We had to get off our butts to do
Yes.
something.
That's why I appreciate the human agency, right? It's not just, oh, God's gonna fix it. God fixes it through human agency as we respond.
We'll sit here and wait for God to do something.
Yeah.
Or that even, I think, more radically, at least what I heard of it, saying that God has already fixed it because God already sees and hears and values.
Yes.
So, yeah, we just have to live into it.
Yeah.
Stumble the people that we are.
Again, thank you. Oh, wonderful.